I've been tasked to kind of give us an overview of some of the kind of economic and public health headwinds that we're facing. And I think, this kind of exercise is partially about bearing witness to the truth of what's happening, that it's easier to bear witness together than alone, and to also understand that there are these very large structural forces which are at play. And it's always good to remember that in a society that's constantly telling us that we're to blame as individuals for our individual choices, for the situation we find ourselves in. So of course, we know we're living in the largest public health pandemic in the last 100 years. As of Friday, according to the Financial Times, a London-based newspaper, we have over 19 million confirmed cases and over 700,000 deaths globally. As you could see here, the bigger the red circle, the more deaths there are directly attributed to COVID, with the United States being the world leader. And this is how it's looking in our country. Again, the bigger the red circle, the more deaths attributed to coronavirus. Again, this is likely an understatement of the total deaths, but this is the data that we have. As you could see, we're closing in now. This is the New York Times analysis to close to 5 million cases in the United States and over 160,000 deaths. This is, I think, important to say that this is still the first wave. This is not the second wave. This is the first wave of this crisis. And we know that United States virtually stands alone in mismanaging this crisis, and that the great bulk of the death and sickness and distress was utterly preventable. That there was ample time, there was ample resources to prepare an adequate public health response, and that time was squandered and has led us to this situation. And I think, rightly much of our attention is focused on, this public health crisis, but as we'll see, there's also large economic implications. These are the current hotspots as of Friday. And as you see, our brothers and sisters in the South are experiencing some of the worst hotspots right now. And of course, the South is traditionally underserved when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to public health resources. And so this is very, very concerning. This is not limited to cities. This is very active in rural areas. This is not limited to blue states. This is all states. It's happening in all 50 states, but right now the South has some of the fastest growing areas which are currently out of control. So we want to look at a really unprecedented unemployment crisis that we're currently experiencing in the United States. That if we look at the people who have applied for unemployment for the first time since the crisis hit in the middle of March, over 55 million American workers have applied for unemployment. This is unprecedented, and the press has been focusing on how these numbers are going down week by week. But the truth is, even if we take the most recent weeks of numbers, if that alone would be a major unemployment crisis and would be double the single worst week of the Great Recession, which started in the fall of 2007, 2008, 2009. So this is a jobs crisis like we've never experienced before, including in the Great Depression. This maps that same initial unemployment claims data going back to the 1960s. You could see the gray lines represent recessions, and the Great Recession of 07, 08, and 09, you could see that small bump in unemployment claims created a jobs crisis that took 10 years to recover the jobs we lost in that previous recession. And the jobs that came back paid less than the jobs that disappeared. You can compare that to the dark blue line on the far right side to see that this is a scale of joblessness at a speed of unfolding that we have just no precedent for. Of that 55 million, the Department of Labor estimates that there are about 33 million workers who are either on unemployment benefits or have applied and are waiting to hear whether they qualify. This, of course, has hit the poorest the worst, and that those making households making under $40,000 a year made up over 40% of the jobs lost at the beginning of this crisis in March. And this has been, not experienced equally by any measure, that all of the deep grooves of injustice that our society has been living through have been exacerbated, have been worsened by this crisis. This includes both the gender and racial dynamics of this, comparing white men, white women, black men, black women, and February is the darkest blue, March is the medium, April is the lightest. To see that in April, white men had an official unemployment rate, which we know understates things, but is still, at least a target, a point. To compare 12.8%, white women 15.8%, Black men 16.4%, Black women 16.9%, official unemployment numbers. What's happened is that as of last week, Congress failed to renew the additional $600 in unemployment benefits a week. That means that the average benefit has dropped from about $930 a week to $330 a week for those 33 million families who are on unemployment benefits. We know that that additional $600 a week has been what has been allowing millions of families to barely hold on. We know also that the loss of the purchasing power of the billions of dollars that's been suddenly taken away by a Congress that has failed to act responsibly is going to have big impacts, not just on those who've lost that unemployment benefit, but on the economy as a whole. Our economy is dependent on consumer spending. 83% of all economic activity is driven by consumer spending. So we can expect, now that that benefit has been taken away, a dramatic coming drop in consumer spending, which will play out across the rest of the economy. I apologize, I'm going quickly. But of course, we're in a major healthcare crisis at the same time. In addition to just the direct effects of the pandemic, a study by the Kaiser Family Foundation, which was relatively early, it was looking at between March 1st and May 2nd, at a time when only 31 million people had filed for unemployment. They estimated that during that time, 26.8 million families lost their employer-sponsored health insurance. If we do a rough, use their same methodology and put in the 55 million that have now filed for unemployment insurance, we would get about a roughly 45 million families losing their employer-sponsored insurance in the midst of the greatest health crisis in 100 years, which is much greater than the 5 million number that's repeated by the press, which I think radically understates the case. Of course, already in 2018, there was 27.9 million non-elderly people who were already uninsured. So this is doubling to nearly tripling our uninsured population. There's been no extension of healthcare during this pandemic other than the extension of COBRA benefits, which if you qualify for them, you probably can't afford them, and is basically useless to anybody. We have an opposition party candidate in Joe Biden who has declared on multiple times that he would veto Medicare for all if Congress passed and it came to his desk as president during a pandemic. At the same time, United Healthcare, one of the nation's largest insurers, posted its greatest quarterly profit in its corporate history, $66 billion in a single quarter. A lot of this is because people had to put off other health services because hospitals were jammed with COVID cases or for fears of COVID exposure. And so as we were racked by this once in a century public health crisis, the health insurance industry made record profits. At the same time, the housing crisis is just beginning to unfold as federal and state moratoriums on evictions have begun to expire. This is New Orleans. This is Kansas. We know that almost a third of people failed to pay their rent or mortgage in June, a record high. And that a independent study by the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project, who are economists and lawyers, estimate that between 19 and 23 million renters are likely to be evicted by the end of September. A more recent update of this that started with this same study extended this to the end of 2020, and the new estimate is that between 28 and 39, almost 40 million tenants are at risk of eviction by the end of the year. That's not including, homeowners who could fail to pay their mortgage, who will be in eviction proceedings, which will also number at least in the millions. Unless there's radical and dramatic action, we're going to see a wave of homelessness that we've literally never seen before. Similarly with hunger, these are food lines. This is in Minneapolis, Minnesota. This is in Des Moines, Iowa. This is in Sunrise, Florida. And this is in San Antonio, Texas. It's very difficult to get an estimate of the true extent of hunger before this crisis. 14 million households, about 11% were considered food insecure. 11 million children were food insecure already in the United States in 2018. And Feeding America tried to do an estimate of the likely impact on hunger. It's back in April 22nd. As you could see, before the crisis of 07-08, there was about 35 million food insecure people. It took a full 10 years to recover to get down to that level of 35 million after the last recession. And now the likely scenario is another 25 million, adding up to a total of 60 million Americans facing hunger during this crisis. At the same time, this is, as I said, not at all hitting equally. At the same time, this is between March 18th and June 11th, when 44 million people had applied for unemployment. US billionaires had gained $637 billion in wealth. And in fact, if we brought that up to August 5th, US billionaires gained $685 billion worth of wealth. Individually, Jeff Bezos gained $71 billion to be the first human being to own more than $100 billion in human history. Mark Zuckerberg gained $37 billion during this crisis, and Elon Musk $45 billion. And this is, a level of inequality, again, that is unprecedented, that we've never before experienced, and this crisis has radically increased this level of inequality. To conclude, there is cause for hope, despite the fact that a sober look is frightening at our near-term economic future in this country. But we've seen with the Black Lives Matter uprisings, which are unprecedented in both their scale and their scope. Numerous studies have shown that more people participated in Black Lives Matter protests in June of this year than any other protest in United States history. Kaiser Family Foundation estimates that up to 10% of the entire country participated in a protest action. And this was not confined, like in the 60s, just to the big cities, but this wave of activity has hit, from the biggest cities to the smallest towns, to the suburbs, to the rural areas, and its extensiveness is also unprecedented. I think that is a hopeful sign. I think that at the same time that we're experiencing, a 100-year public health crisis and quite possibly a 100-year depression to follow, that at the same time we're witnessing a mass political awakening. We're seeing people coming into the streets, coming into a kind of critical consciousness in a way that we have not seen in generations. And I think despite the fact that we have many, many challenges in front of us, there's also real grounds for hope in people coming together across historic lines of division to work collectively, collaboratively to solve these problems, because these problems can only be solved by a massive social movement. These problems can't be solved individually. They require the resources of the federal and states governments, and to do that, it requires a massive movement of people to force those in power to do the right thing in this moment, to keep things from getting even worse. And I think the kind of spirit and the unity that is displayed here in the Freedom Church of the Poor is part of that inspiration, is part of that motion in these very dark and challenging times. So thank you for your attention.